Carl Jung often described the psyche as a landscape and having several layers: ego consciousness, personal unconscious, the collective unconscious. In this video, you'll understand better what happens when fear arises and why it's important to set a boundary and what happens when you don't. Here, the TV inside the head represents the ego, the conscious mind where thoughts and perceptions appear. All the rest of the space inside the head represents the personal unconscious, holding memories and experiences outside our awareness. The antennas extend, reaching into space to symbolize the mind's connection to the collective unconscious, which is a shared field of archetypal patterns. If that confuses you, hang tight. When you're driving a car or grocery shopping, you're mainly operating in the conscious mind, the ego. But the personal unconscious is still helping in the background. Here's how it works. Conscious mind, the ego, is primary, and it makes decisions like which lane, which brand of cereal, paying attention to the environment, always planning and evaluating. This is the active screen of awareness, the ego. The personal unconscious has a supporting role here. A lot of the behavior is actually automatic, coming from learned habits stored below our awareness. It's muscle memory while driving, knowing where things are in the grocery store, following routines without thinking much. That's why sometimes you can drive somewhere and barely remember the trip. Your personal unconscious handled most of the process. The collective unconscious is not usually involved in routine tasks unless something symbolic, emotional, or dreamlike is happening, but we'll get into that later. A short way to explain it is during everyday tasks like driving, shopping, the ego is conscious and directing behavior, while the personal unconscious supplies habits and learned patterns automatically. Using the TV as a metaphor for the ego, a lot of the technical work behind the scenes is stored in the settings, and automatic functions are coming from the personal unconscious. When you're dreaming, the ego, your normal waking awareness, is mostly inactive or loosened. It's not fully controlling your thoughts the way it does when you're awake. The personal unconscious, well, this is the main source of dream content. Dreams often pull from forgotten memories, unresolved emotions, personal conflicts, or repressed experiences. Sometimes dreams include archetypal imagery from the collective unconscious, like symbols or figures that feel universal or myth-like. A short way to say it is during dreams, the ego steps back and the personal unconscious becomes active, sometimes expressing deeper archetypal patterns from the collective unconscious. When you're awake, the ego is holding the remote. When you're dreaming, the remote is floating somewhere in space and the unconscious is choosing its programming. The ego thinks it has the remote, but sometimes the remote is floating somewhere in space and the unconscious is choosing the programming. Now, the ego displays what's coming from the personal and collective unconscious, so they do influence the content that appears on the screen. So what this illustration shows is the TV screen is the conscious awareness. It's small, it's limited, but much of the mind operates outside the conscious control. The psyche is connected to something larger than the individual. The personal unconscious holds emotions and qualities that we have disowned. So strong emotions can be explained as signals rising from deeper layers of the psyche and suddenly taking over the screen. The most common source of strong emotions are coming from the personal unconscious inside the head, as you can see around the television set that you see. And it's also where complexes are stored. Complexes are simply clusters of memories and feelings and experience we're not always aware of consciously. When something in the environment triggers one of these emotional energies or complexes, it pushes onto the TV screen, the ego consciousness. For example, someone criticizes you. A past emotional memory gets activated, and suddenly the TV screen is full of either anger, shame, or fear. And the ego sees the emotion but didn't actually create it in that moment. What you are seeing here are rising emotions that are temporary activations from stored complexes. And here's the crazy thing. the ego takes responsibility for creating it. In Carl Jung's framework, disowned parts of ourselves are qualities, feelings, or impulses we've pushed out of awareness because at some point they felt unacceptable, unsafe, or unwanted. These become part of what Jung called the shadow. Some simple everyday examples might be of the nice person who disowns anger. You learned good people don't get angry, so you suppressed anger. Another way to explain it is around the TV in the personal unconscious space, we have shadowy silhouettes representing disowned traits, impulses, or qualities. Shadow material can influence the ego even when hidden. Remember, these parts live in the personal unconscious, just outside the ego's immediate awareness. They can and do influence our emotions, our thoughts, and our behaviors without us even realizing it. These are bits of ourselves that we didn't want to watch, and yet somehow they keep sneaking onto the TV screen anyway. You can see here the collective unconscious is the deepest layer of the psyche, containing universal patterns and archetypes shared by all humans. Even if we're not aware of it, these patterns can influence our dreams, our thoughts, and our behaviors, like signals from a larger field entering the TV screen of consciousness. But the collective unconscious is the cosmic broadcast. Sometimes it sends signals, archetypal stories, universal symbols, or dream material that pop up on your screen, whether you ask for them or not. Boundaries are filters that control mechanisms of the ego. They determine what signals, emotions, and influences get to the conscious mind. Healthy boundaries help the ego recognize and integrate shadow material or archetypal influences without being overwhelmed. See, without boundaries, the signals from the personal or collective unconscious can flood the ego, and then our emotions can run wild. We can have shadowy traits that dominate and can confuse us. The role of fear in the psyche will show you that fear functions like an internal alarm system. It tells us when something feels unsafe, overwhelming, or misaligned with who we are becoming. In the language of the psyche, fear is often the moment when something from the unconscious approaches the screen of awareness. Boundaries help us to respond to that signal. They create enough safety for us to face what is emerging without abandoning ourselves or becoming overwhelmed. In other words, fear alerts us, and the boundaries help us to respond with internal wisdom. When something from the unconscious or the collective unconscious begins to surface, the ego often experiences it as fear. Fear acts like an alarm signal on the screen of awareness, telling us that something important is emerging, and boundaries create the safety we need to stay present with what's arising. Same is true with shadow material emerging. Fear equals our first reaction. Boundaries add protection while we integrate the material. In many myths, the hero feels fear, let's say at the entrance to a cave or before facing the dragon. That fear isn't meaningless. It signals that something powerful is about to emerge. Boundaries give us the safety to approach while without being consumed by it. You see, all humans instinctively recognize this. So if fear is the psyche's alarm system, the next question becomes, how do we recognize when that alarm is actually telling us a boundary is needed? Because our bodies and emotions often know before our conscious mind does. I'll repeat that. Our bodies and emotions often know before our conscious mind does. Sometimes signals show up as strong emotions like resentment, anxiety, anger, or exhaustion. These feelings often appear when something in our environment is crossing an internal line. There are the physical signals. The body often registers a boundary violation before the mind does. Tension in the stomach, tightness in the chest, fatigue, or a sense of withdrawal. There are behavioral signals. We may notice ourselves over-explaining, people-pleasing, avoiding conflict, or saying yes when something inside us is clearly saying no. These are signals often messages from deeper parts of a psyche, parts that are trying to protect something important within us. The next logical step becomes how to set a boundary, and we'll show you the steps exactly on how to do this. First, we notice the signal. Awareness begins. We notice the internal signal in our bodies. One might feel fear, tension, anger, or some sort of discomfort. Here we illustrate we have an overwhelm signal. Maybe you've taken on too much and you're tired, but normally you just keep going. Can anyone relate here? Next, we name what is happening. Just simply notice the word in our mind. Overwhelm, pressure, discomfort, anger, whatever that might be. The ego then begins to identify and make sense of the signal, so we actually hear this in our minds. We name the experience in our minds to help bring unconscious material into conscious awareness. But then there's a step after this. We need to communicate the boundary. The boundary is expressed externally with our mouths. Note, you see here, the ego literally communicates the limit. Then we hold the boundary. Notice the protective boundary around the ego? It becomes a signal to bounce gently off the ego and remain stable and calm, meaning the boundary is maintained even if the pressure continues. Holding the boundary protects the new emerging self and maintains psychological safety. What's the new emerging self? Well, it could be a new truth, a clearer sense of limits, a previously disowned feeling like anger, grief, strength, or overwhelm, a more authentic voice. Yes, that's all inside of you. Setting a boundary is not just one moment, it's an actual process. First, we notice the signal. What's happening in our bodies? Then we name what's happening. What am I actually feeling? Is it overwhelm? Then we name it in our minds first. Then we communicate it out loud so a boundary can be held. And finally, we hold it. Holding the boundary protects the new emerging self and maintains psychological safety. Very often, the feeling we want to push away is actually the signal that a boundary is needed. When we learn to listen to that signal and respond with clarity inside of silence, we create a relationship built on honesty instead of resentment.